Hi there, everyone. So this is a presentation on my thesis. It's called 1800 to Zero, and it's about pathways to a zero carbon US power grid. I originally presented this at the Plan 2 Thesis Symposium. I'll go ahead and link that elsewhere in this post, but that was a little bit rushed, so I decided to re-record it. There won't be Q&A in this, but ideally this is probably a little bit better talk. And because I won't feel as rushed, I probably will be at least a little bit more coherent. So just to give a brief overview of what I want to talk about today, there's going to be just a brief discussion on why all this matters. Then I'll talk about where we are. I'll overview some of the issues that grid operators think about, and then I'll dive into some technological solutions along with some policy solutions to help drive that transition along. So let's talk about why this matters. In 2018, the U.S. power grid produced about 1,800 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions, and that's about 27% of all of the U.S. emissions and about 3.5% of all the global emissions for that year. And those emissions come with a cost. So my estimate is that it's somewhere around $147 billion in 2011. And most of these costs come in the form of premature deaths due to air pollution. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that if you have a zero carbon power grid that's just as reliable as the power grid was in 2011, you would have saved hundreds of billions of dollars annually in these hidden costs. And, just kind of zooming out, the bigger picture really is that the other reason that getting the US power grid to zero is that it enables other sectors of the economy. So for example, industry, transportation, it enables those sectors of the economy to reduce their emissions as they electrify also. So let's take a brief look at where we are right now. So this chart basically shows where electricity has come from over the past 2 decades. About 63% of the electricity in the US comes from either coal, which is in black, or natural gas, which is in gray. And so these are 2 major sources of fossil fuel powered electricity. There's been that really steady trend lately for natural gas to replace coal. And if you subtract out the 63%, obviously you have about 37% of electricity that's coming from carbon-free sources. So you have that big yellow section in the middle of the chart. That's nuclear. That's been pretty stagnant, and it's provided a very steady 20% of US power for the past few decades. Other sources like hydropower and geothermal have also been fairly stagnant. But if you look at that top section of the chart in blue and gold, that's what represents wind and solar, which, on one hand, they don't amount to that much yet, but it's also very clear that they're growing very quickly. So, about at the halfway mark in 2010, solar is not even on the radar. And if you go back to 2000, at the very left end of the chart, wind isn't on the map either. And a large reason for why these trends are the way they are is just it all comes down to cost. So if you look at these charts, on the left, you see the cost of wind and how fast that's dropped over the past decade or so. And on the right-hand side, you see how fast the price of solar has dropped over the past decade or so. And so because these forms of electricity are so much cheaper now, and because their costs have come down so rapidly, we find that a lot of the increases in grid capacity and grid generation capacity, so all the additions to the US electricity grid, mostly come from solar or wind or natural gas. And most of the retirements, or I guess subtractions from the grid, if you will, those come mainly from coal, a little bit from nuclear, and a lot also from older natural gas plants that are less efficient. So, we've kind of established where electricity comes from. And I guess at this point, a very fair question to ask is, well, okay, wind and solar are so competitive, so what's the real problem, right? Why don't you just build out a ton of that, call it a day? And so to do that, to understand why that is, you have to discuss a few important terms first. The real goal, obviously, is to keep the grid stable. And to keep a grid stable, you need reliability. And specifically when I say reliability, what I mean is that you need to always have enough generation capacity. So every single second of every single day, you need to always have enough generation capacity to match the amount of electricity you use. So, these charts both show how much power is being used in Texas specifically, both over the course of a day, which is on the left-hand side, as well as over the course of a year on the right-hand side. So if we look at that day chart, we note how, power usage really spikes in the evening around that 4 p.m.-ish mark. When people get home, AC units start running and all the appliances turn on. And then zooming out on the right-hand side, looking at the year, we see that, again, peak demand happens usually in those summer months, and that's primarily due to ACs and cooling. So if you want that reliable system, you need to build enough capacity to satisfy demand all of the time, which means that you need to build to match that annual peak demand, which is represented by this orange line here. Even though most of the time during the year, you're going to have equipment that's sitting idle. So the second thing is that you need to have a steady grid frequency. And so basically the way to think about this is that you can't just have enough supply at all times. You need to exactly match supply and demand. So this is the basic idea behind frequency regulation, which is really important because otherwise a lot of the hardware and infrastructure that we have just immediately breaks down. So, we know that we need to match supply and demand at all times exactly and perfectly. But the problem is that, even though demand varies from second to second as people turn lights on and off, as people, charge their cars or run their dryers or whatever, from second to second that changes. But wind and solar also output different amounts of power from second to second. It's kind of a trope at this point, but the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And there are also regular climate patterns throughout the year that make wind and solar more or less effective depending on the month. So starting in that left chart, this is what we call intermittency. So intermittency just refers to a generator, in this case solar, not producing a consistent amount of power throughout the day. And then on the right-hand side, we see seasonality. So basically, on a month-to-month basis, how effective a wind turbine is changes depending on which part of the country you're in. So now the question actually becomes, okay, given the intermittency and seasonality from wind and solar, how do you ensure that you're always able to match up supply and demand in a zero carbon power grid? And that's where some technologies come into play. So the first step is batteries. They're a great solution to fixing the daily intermittency problem. And they're really, really good at storing hours of power. So we'll just take a quick look at what that looks like. So if you look at the lighter green section of this chart, that's supposed to represent solar production throughout the day. And you'll notice that, basically at nighttime, solar isn't producing anything. And so the basic idea of batteries is that you charge up grid batteries when you have a lot of excess solar production. So basically in that bottom part of the chart below the zero line, you see this dark gray section. So that represents charging up grid batteries. And then at night, when solar starts to fade and when solar is not producing as much power, you can discharge those batteries, which is that orange section towards the middle right-hand side of the graph. The really interesting thing about batteries is how fast their prices have been declining over the past decade. So between 2010 and 2020, you've seen basically a 90% drop in the cost to make lithium-ion batteries. And that's largely due to a lot of heavy R&D from the consumer electronics sector, as well as the automotive sector. And those prices enable these really large-scale projects. One of these examples is the Hornsdale Power Reserve in South Australia. Here's a photo of that. And I mean, this one battery system is largely responsible for solving the massive majority of South Australia's power grid blackouts. It's also been enormously profitable for both the developers of the project, but also for consumers who have really felt the benefits in terms of, A, increased grid reliability, but also B, marginally reduced costs. But when you zoom out from a day to a year, there are other storage technologies that become a lot more attractive. So one of those is hydrogen. Hydrogen just becomes a lot more attractive than batteries are when you want to store a large amount of power for months at a time. Now, the downside is that hydrogen is also less efficient overall in terms of energy in versus energy out. And it's also pretty difficult to store and transport. But at the same time, it's also more broadly important for other industries' decarbonization. So it's going to be something that we need to focus on overall. And there's actually one other issue associated with solar and wind that I didn't mention before that has to do with geography. It's not actually strongest where people live. So if we look at that left map, this is basically where wind is the most effective. So look at those red and purple areas for where wind is strongest. And on the right-hand side, again, look at those red and purple areas. That's where solar is the most effective. But the problem is that most of the population lives on the East Coast, in New England, and a little bit, another sizable chunk of the population is in California. But again, you'll notice that this isn't necessarily where the optimal location for wind and solar are. And so this wouldn't really be an issue if you could transport electricity over long distances in large quantities. But today's infrastructure is a pretty large bottleneck to this problem. So here's a map of the US power grid as it really is. So all the different lines are laid out here, and different colors represent these things called interconnects. And functionally speaking, the interconnects are different grids. So we see these pink lines that represent what are called high voltage direct current lines. These are really useful for transmitting a large amount of power efficiently over long distances. And you have these pink triangles kind of down the middle of the US that represent where power can flow between the interconnects. But as you can see, there's a very limited amount of capacity here, which means that if you produce a lot of excess capacity in Texas and you want to send it to New Mexico, you're effectively limited by the capacity of those pink triangles or back-to-backs. So expanding transmission infrastructure is really important, since that's what enables new investment into generation in the first place. Without transmission capacity in an area, you can't really build out new generation capacity. And so therefore, there are really three main goals to building out the transmission grid for future demand. The first thing is that you need to build more regional transmission AC lines. But on top of that, you also need to build new HVDC or high voltage direct current lines for efficient long distance transmission. And you also want to upgrade the interties or the back-to-backs to bridge those interconnects and improve their ability to share power. So I've already talked a little bit about storage and transmission, and those are great technologies, super important to seasonality and intermittency. But you're also going to need some other technologies to reduce the cost of which you build that reliable, clean power grid. So the first one is just overbuilding. So just building more solar and wind than you necessarily need. That will basically, on a region by region basis, you just evaluate, okay, do I want to build more transmission and storage, or do I want to just build out more generation in the first place? And you just do whatever's cheapest. So that can basically be done on a region by region basis. The second thing is nuclear. So nuclear is actually really important to the grid moving forward when it comes to keeping existing plants online. So keeping existing plants online and extending their lifespan is basically the cheapest option out there for zero carbon clean power. It also has the benefit of having zero intermittency issues or zero seasonality issues. That being said, new nuclear plants are about twice the cost averaged out over the course of all the electricity that will be produced as just extending the lifespan of existing ones, which basically makes them completely uncompetitive when it comes to cost. So building new plants is really unlikely to occur unless you have some really serious innovation or some major technological breakthrough. And then finally, there's carbon capture. Carbon capture is basically really important because it can enable existing infrastructure, e.g. natural gas power plants that we have already built, to serve as a safety net to the grid. So it's a really key technology. It has major uses, again, outside of the power sector. So it's going to be something that we have to pursue anyway. So I've talked a lot about the technology at this point. Technology is really important. It's what enables the economically viable zero carbon power grid. But policy is kind of what drives that change. So I really want to take a look at 4 different policies that could be really useful in driving adoption of those technologies and a clean power grid in general. So first off, for renewable portfolio standards. These are basically forcing functions that mandate minimum levels of renewable generation in a certain place by a certain time. They've already been enacted in 30 states in the US so far, but every program is different. And intuitively, how effective an RPS is varies on how you set it up. So if you set this optimistic but achievable target, then you can really drive decarbonization. The second policy I want to talk about is carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is really simple. It's just you're putting a price on carbon. So there's a cost to pollute. It's already been implemented around the world, most notably in Europe, in China, in California. There are actually different schemes of implementing carbon prices. But most important about carbon pricing is the actual pricing aspect. How you price carbon emissions matters a ton in terms of how much you actually reduce emissions by. So here's just a chart that shows some results from modeling done by Breakthrough Energy that basically analyzed how different carbon pricing levels economy wide could affect emissions. And so on that left hand side, we see the kind of business as usual approach, where we can get probably anywhere between 19 and 30, and a 19 and a 26% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. But if you implement a $50 a ton carbon tax, you're looking at anywhere between 39 and 46. And even though these prices are implemented economy-wide, a huge bulk of the additional emissions that are avoided in this $50 a ton scenario actually come from the power sector, about 80% of them. So after this, I want to talk about transmission infrastructure. Obviously, as we know, it's a huge part of the grid as a whole. I mean, it basically is what people think about when they think about the grid. But a large component of how we improve that transmission infrastructure stems from how we plan for transmission infrastructure additions and how we pay for them. And right now, basically, new generators have to pay for grid capacity upgrades that are necessary to add their plant onto the grid, which seems pretty reasonable at first glance. You know, you don't really care where you place a natural gas plant or a coal plant. It's going to be able to produce the same amount of output. But in an era of solar and wind, it makes a lot more sense to build out the transmission grid to enable optimal generation placement, not the other way around. And this is exactly what's happened in Texas and in around the Minnesota area. There have been two enormously successful transmission infrastructure projects. The one in Texas was called the Competitive Renewable Energy Zones. And then there's there's an organization called MISO, and they had their project called the MVP project. And in both cases, what you basically have going on is transmission is being planned regionally, as opposed to the current piece-by-piece method, where every single generator needs to take care of themselves. Both projects have generated major economic benefits, and this comes in a lot of ways. Primarily, it comes in reduced transmission capital costs, but it also, really benefits renewable market penetration also. And the catch with this, though, is that this model is only enabled when end consumers share all the transmission costs that are necessary. So under the current system, a lot of solar and wind projects are delayed, just waiting for someone else to foot the bill for new transmission lines. And then finally, I want to talk about supporting innovation and how we do that. There's a lot of technologies that we still need to fully decarbonize, right? There's carbon capture, there's improved hydrogen production, and there are also a bunch of other technologies that we, can't really foresee at this current moment. But new technologies often face this chicken and egg problem because at small scales, they cost a lot of money, and that drives away potential consumers. But we also have previous subsidies like the investment tax credit, or the ITC, and the production tax credit, or PTC, which have been massively beneficial for assisting the wind and solar industries while they scale. And so I think some reforms to these programs could really help improve their effectiveness. So let's look at some concrete proposals. So the first one, when it comes to renewable portfolio standards, it's a federal level RPS that basically says by 2050, we're going to have a 100% clean power grid. And you'd also want to set interim 5-year targets to both encourage steady progress and also improve the enforceability. On terms of carbon pricing, a $50 a ton inflation-adjusted economy-wide price that also includes a border adjustment tax would be hugely helpful. Where the revenues goes an open question, but I will merely note that the pandemic has demonstrated the feasibility of just giving people money. In terms of transmission infrastructure, I would argue that there needs to be a massive slashing of red tape, along with the adoption of a regional planning model in order to enable vast amounts of solar and wind capacity to be built. And finally, when it comes to supporting innovation, specifically looking at the ITC and PTC, you could extend the timeline of those tax credits. You could change to a direct payment or make the tax credits refundable. You should also probably apply those tax credits to non-generation projects. So, for example, to storage or other decarbonization projects. Now, obviously, implementing all 4 of these policies is ideal. So, in the actual presentation, which again, I'll link below, there was a Q&A section, which I encourage you all to listen to if you want. This is obviously just a summary of a very, very long paper. I think it's like well over 15, 16,000 words at this point. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to read the paper. I'll be posting about that soon enough. And thanks for watching. Bye.